this story is about a period of madness 55 years ago, but I suppose we all go through that in our youth. Before the roads were tarmacked west of Galway for centuries, the Galway Hooker was the fastest and most efficient means of heavy transport in Connemara. Not only turf, but cattle, building materials, and all types of produce were carried in them. And they were also heavily involved in fishing. The hookers, the Boardmore, ranged from 37 to 45 feet in length, and they and their smaller cousins, the gloitugs, were gaff cutter rigged, and the smaller puckons carried a dipping line. And they all had an open hold for cargo. During their working years, and there is the Morningstar in Dunleary, during their working years, none of them had engines, and the skill of the hookermen in handling these craft is legendary. I'm still learning. Until the early years of the last century, Galway Bay was black with hookers. But the coming of the heavy lorries started the reduction of their use. And apart from a brief reprieve during World War II due to the shortage of fuel, by the 1950s, their trading days had come to an end. The turf trade to the Aran Islands kept a few going in the 60s, but even that declined with the coming of bottled gas. By then, all around Connemara, there were hookers lying, slowly rotting away in quite large numbers. I was hooked on their beautiful shape, design, seaworthiness, and the simplicity of their gaff rig. And my dream was to acquire one. I wasn't by any means the first to want to rescue one of these wonderful craft before they disappeared forever. Before I got involved, there were quite a few other people who'd done it. My first interest in these boats was generated in 1963-64, when my friend Jim Halpenny acquired a gloitug. Maeve, in poor condition, restored her and decked her over. But sadly, she was wrecked in a storm in Cole Harbour, Dunleary, shortly after launching. Jim never owned a boat after that, but sailed with me for many years afterwards, and there he is. And by the way, most of my photos were taken with a box Brownlee, black and white, which is a relic of the past. By 1965, I'd secured a good job in Dublin, and living at home had saved up a certain amount of money, but I was by no means wealthy. My pay at that stage was about £15 a week, even in those times, not a hill of beans, and I didn't have a car. Nothing daunted, I put my bike on the train at Heuston Station and pedalled out from Galway against a thumping headwind to Carraroe to see what I could find. Half a century ago, Ireland was a very different place from what it is now, and particularly in the West. Most people in the West at that stage lived in what we would now consider to be poverty. There were very few cars on the road. I didn't see one tractor on any farm in Connemara. This work was done mostly by donkey and cart. Many houses I visited in Connemara had no plumbing and no water supply. Water was carried from the nearest well or pump, and the loo was a hut out in the bog. And there were no fancy kitchens. Cooking was done in many houses on the open turf fire. Most, but by no means all, did have electricity, but telephones were quite rare. As a general rule, nobody spoke English in their own homes west of Galway, and Irish was spoken by many in Galway itself. And in the West, I once heard the amusing comment, he's very good at the English, you know. Having been educated in England, my knowledge of Irish was zero, and it still is pretty well. In 1965, Carraroe, which was my base during the next year, was not the thriving tourist centre it is today, but a very quiet village with a few guest houses, but no hotel, The wild Atlantic way was a long way off. My initial searches for a hooker that was remotely viable were a failure. In every harbour and creek round Great Man's Bay, there were hookers and glow-tugs in the last stages of disintegration. At best, most required a complete rebuild, and at worst, they were complete wrecks. My journey on my bike in torrential rain back to Galway was deeply depressing, not helped by jumping over a hedge to answer the call of nature and landing up to my waist in water. However, over the next 2 weeks, I acquired a motorbike. This machine, a 75cc BSA Beagle, was a complete disaster. It had a maximum speed of 45 mph, and it took me 8 hours to travel from Connolly to Carrow. But when running, it did keep going. And on this, I was able to extend my search around Great Man's Bay to Lettermore and Gorhamna Island, and at Tierney Pier, I found the Morningstar. She was built sometime between 1885 and 1892 by Patrick Brownlee of Parkmore, Oranmore, and had been owned for most, if not all, her existence by the Connolly family, who lived just up the road from the quay. For the previous 13 years, she'd been virtually unused, lying against the quay wall. And there she is. That's the way I found her. Interesting picture. It shows the big belly and the tumble home, which is the standard design of all the hookers, glow-tugs and puck-ons and trading craft in the West. I think the belly probably increases the amount of cargo to be held, and also I think the tumble home may to some extent have kept loose cargo like turf dry in heavy weather. And there may be a Dutch ancestry to that shape as well. On initial inspection, I wasn't encouraged. There seemed to be rot all over the place, including the keel. And leaning against the quay for so long, she'd become slightly twisted. Looking from forward, the stem leaned slightly to port, and from aft, the stern post leant slightly to starboard. However, at high water, she floated, which is more than I'd seen of the wrecks up till then. I went up to the house and was greeted by Joe Connolly and the entire family. He was a most charming individual with whom I became great friends. And indeed, I've kept in touch with some of the family ever since. And there he is. I asked him if she was for sale, and after some family consultation, he said she was. The price he was asking was £200 in her present condition. When I pointed out that she would require a huge amount of restoration to make her seaworthy, he said, to my great surprise, "No problem. We'll get our local boat builder, Michael Willie Flaherty of Lettermullen, to have a look at her." So Michael Flaherty came from Lettermullen and looked her over and said he would carry out the restoration. But I would have to acquire all the timber and materials. Joe Connolly said he knew where we could get the timber, and he would work along with Michael when needed. Michael said for the work, he would charge £100 a week. When I think of this now, I realize that I could have been taken to the cleaners, but I was convinced that I was dealing with scrupulously honest people, and my assessment proved correct. On the 16th of May, 1965, I purchased the Morningstar for £200. On my way home, I did wonder what I'd let myself in for. Here was I, aged 22, on a clapped-out motorbike with a 12-ton cargo-carrying vessel lying against a quay in Connemara. But when one is young and unmarried and with no commitments, one does these things. The purchase of the timber followed. Apparently, there were 2 sawmills in Gort, and I took Joe riding pillion on the bike to one of them, Patrick Cahill sawmills of Cool Park, Gort, and lying in the fields round the mill were dozens of oak and larch trees. Somewhat to my concern, Joe ordered almost every tree in sight. I'd have that one and that one and that one and that one. The mill was to cut the oak in 3-inch planks for the frame and the larch into 1¼ inch for the planking. The price was £37. Even in those hard times, I considered this incredibly cheap. 2 weeks later, I was down at Tierney again and was astonished to see all the cut timber stacked on the quay. Apparently, Joe had arranged the services of a seaweed lorry coming back empty from Gort. And when I asked him how much I owed for this, he said, "Oh, don't bother yourself. We paid him in poachine." The drink driving laws were a bit ad hoc in those days. Not long after that, there was a very high spring tide, and we floated the Morningstar as high up the beach as we could get her and sank her onto level ground. She had no engine and no equipment on board. There was a hole bored in one of the garboard planks with a plug in it, and we simply pulled the plug. I've never deliberately sunk a boat in my life, and it was a strange sensation of watching the water coming in beneath my feet. Here she was to lie, high and dry, most of the time, for the next year. Here, Michael Willie Flaherty set to work on the open beach in sometimes quite severe weather. To my knowledge, he used no power tools of any kind, only hand tools. And he cut the 3-inch thick oak planks into shape with a handsaw. Each item must have taken hours of heavy work, and over the months to come, he replaced about a dozen each of the ribs, floors, and knees, the mast step, stern post, and rudder. And that is the frame of the Morningstar. The reason for the massive construction of the Galway Hooker is they were able to hold a heavy full load of cargo and sit on the ground at low tide without it distorting the hull. But it's quite impressive when you look at a picture like that. None of the oak purchased was long enough to make a keel, which required to be one piece, and the keel certainly needed replacement. Here again, local knowledge was the key. Apparently, Joe and Michael were aware of a wreck out in Ross Muck, which had a good beach keel under it. Beach doesn't last long in fresh water, but in seawater, it hardens progressively over time and becomes almost indestructible. The wreck, which apparently was also called the Morningstar, was of a hooker significantly bigger than my boat, so the keel would have been more than adequate. When Joe and I arrived in Ross Muck, the wreck was invisible underwater. It was owned by an elderly man who lived with his hens and ducks in a tumble-down cottage nearby. He constantly chewed tobacco, which had dribbled down his beard and his waistcoat over time, with unfortunate results. He was delighted to see us, and negotiations were completed in Irish, and the keel, which was completely invisible, purchased for £2. He also sold us a rudder bar for ½ a crown, 2 shillings and 6 pence, a few cents in today's money. I never discovered how the beach keel was extracted from the wreck, but 2 weeks later, it and the rudder bar were on the quay at Tierney, having been brought over on an empty turf lorry at a cost of £1. Over the following months, the restoration work moved slowly and steadily ahead. Sometimes very little progress seemed to be made, and sometimes it seemed to be flying, and I knew that would be the way of it, particularly as it was being done in the open with no shelter. The most astonishing development was when I came down and found the new keel cut, shaped, and fitted. And there it is. To do this, the boat had been levered up on her side and held there with balks of timber. No jacks or mechanics had been used. It was all done by manpower and leverage. And you can see the boat is actually supported by this bulk of timber, and it's jacked up a bit. The keel had been pinned through the floors with steel rods, and Michael must have achieved much of this work on his back on the shingle. When the frame was complete, the larch planking went in wherever needed and was caulked with oakum. And there it is. Not a huge amount of planking, but a certain amount on each side. The boat was lying on her side on the beach, so the day came when she had to be turned over onto the other bilge. Joe Connolly was obviously a very popular man in the area, because one day he summoned every active man from a considerable radius around Tierney, and about 20 turned up. They slowly levered all 12 tons of her up with spars, wedges, and muscle power into an almost upright position. And that on the right is Joe Connolly supervising operations. When she was almost vertical, about 20 men holding her.
Just listen to
about half of them. Sorry, there's a bit of interference there. When there's about 20 men holding her, about half of them ran round the other side to lower her gently onto a bed of motor tires laid out on the beach. And there they are giving her a last push when she got to the vertical. The lad sitting on the top was in a very dangerous position. I began to realize then how the pyramids were built. And there they are letting her down on the motor tires on the other side. Every fortnight, there developed an unshakable routine. I would ride down at weekend, greet Joe and Michael at the boat. We'd discuss the progress. I'd hand over the £200, and we would then proceed to the local pub where Michael would buy the first round, each pint being followed by a neat whiskey chaser. When I look back on this, I am aware that my driving after these sessions was not always 100%. And I do remember one evening in the dark, taking a wrong turn and realizing in time I was driving down a boreen into the bog, but no harm done. As the weeks and months went by, the work steadily proceeded and my savings steadily declined. However, I was in luck. In November, a dear cousin had died and left me a pot of money, and this saved the day. I ditched the motorbike and bought a car, which halved the journey time from Dublin and enabled me to travel in reasonable comfort. It also enabled me to transport any gear or rigging required for the boat. The weather deteriorated significantly in December, and this with the short days stopped all work on the boat till April 1966. An amusing incident happened in the week before Christmas 1965 when I visited the Connollys and checked on the boat. They sent me home with a Christmas present of a sack of potatoes and carrots, all homegrown. And I also had a bucket of sand in the car in case I got stuck in the snow. Rounding a sharp bend on the way home, I was confronted with a huge roadblock and about 30 Gardaí manning it. The sergeant in charge poked his head through the window and said, "We're looking for illicit spirits." Whereupon I got out and let them search the entire car, and they did it very thoroughly and digging through the carrots and potatoes and the sand. There was clearly terrible disappointment when they couldn't find any poachine. The sergeant's farewell comment was, "In any case, them are the best carrots I've seen coming out of Connemara." When they heard of this incident later, it caused endless hilarity amongst the Connollys, who made me carry a bottle labeled poachine containing none too clean bog water in the car from then on. The restoration work was finally completed by June 1966, and the boat thoroughly tarred, but the running rigging needed complete replacement. This was also achieved using local knowledge. We called it a pub, the location of which I don't recall, possibly at Marm Cross. There was no indication from outside that this was any more than a pub. To my great astonishment, upstairs was a ship chandler's with enough rope and gear to fit out a fleet of hookers. Of course, there was no modern terraline rope. It was manila, which was very adequate. So the halyards, main sheet, headsail sheets, shrouds and warps, with a few other items such as blocks, etc., were all acquired at knockdown prices. And during this time, I also acquired a fine grapnel anchor for £3. When I look back on all this, it makes me sad that all this equipment was lying around, almost abandoned. But that's the way it was then. The sails were ancient, but apparently robust enough to use. They were calico, of course. The mainsail was acquired during the war from the Department of Fisheries and was wartime green khaki, and obviously originally of superb quality. I suspect the headsails were also pre-war, but appeared to be okay. The one issue which could not be addressed locally was the boom and gaff jaws were in poor condition. They were okay for local sailing, but one wouldn't chance them on a long trip. When the Star was fully rigged, I decided to take her for a sail. And with the help of a local lad on a quiet day, sailed her across Great Man's Bay to Cullaghaig Quay at Carraroe. I was absolutely delighted by the Star's handling and performance under sail. She pointed a lot closer to the wind than I expected. My confidence was hugely enhanced by being able to handle her, and I had no problem bringing her in under sail, round the reef just outside Cullaghaig, and safely into the quay. On returning to the quay at Chilney, we saw a great crowd of people out to see us come in, which we achieved safely. The older folk considered this behavior outrageous because nobody under the age of 50 was considered competent to help helm aboard more, least of all a 24-year-old from Dublin. I think my young crew got an awful roasting from his dad. The only way to get the spars replaced was to sail up to Galway, where there was a shipwright who could do the job. And 9th of July was the chosen date for departure. Unfortunately, my main crew, who had sailing experience, were unavailable. And the only crew available was a fit, enthusiastic teenager, Ray Smith, who had very little sailing experience. So I made contact with Pat Jennings, one of the prime fishermen in Galway, who had spent all his young days fishing in hookers under sail. And incidentally, I did actually race against him in years following, and I could never beat him. He was a brilliant seaman and a brilliant helmsman. There is the day before sailing. On the left is Joe Connolly, looking very sad, and not surprising, because the next day the Morningstar was going to sail away, and she had been in his family since he was born. And in the middle is Ray Smith, my friend, And on the right is Michael Willie Flaherty, the boat builder. Did all this wonderful work. Pat and Colin Bailey agreed to come out to Tierney and sail her up to Galway. They came out to Tierney the evening before to assess the boat. Pat reckoned there was not nearly enough ballast in her, so a huge amount of granite rocks were piled up and loaded into her. They were to come the following morning at 6 a.m. and we'd take the flood tide up to Galway. Unfortunately, the ballast was not properly packed down, and we were not aware that the slight list that the boat had into the quay had been eliminated. During the night, the boat took the ground at low tide as usual. Ray and I, asleep in the forecastle, were awakened at 2 a.m. by the terrifying feeling of the boat falling out from the quay. We expected a shattering crash, but fortunately, there was enough water in her, under her, to cushion her fall, and no damage done. And miraculously, the ballast hadn't shifted. However, our anxiety that damage would be apparent when she floated on the next tide, a fear which turned out actually to be unnecessary, kept us awake for the rest of the night. And when Pat and Colin Bailey arrived at about 7:30, they found two very forlorn figures who'd had no breakfast and very little sleep. Added to which, it was a cold, miserable morning with a steady drizzle and very poor visibility. However, there was a moderate breeze from the southwest, and we tacked out into Galway Bay and bore away for Galway on a broad reach, and the Star really showed her paces. Pat was absolutely delighted with her and kept saying she's a handy, handy boat, one of the best. To hear a seasoned seaman praise our old craft in this fashion was a great pleasure to me. The land was barely visible to port, but Pat scorned my compass, which was a wartime grid compass designed for aircraft navigation. In any case, he knew Galway Bay like the back of his hand. Colin Bailey pulled out a flask of whiskey from his pocket, which also raised our spirits. And we shortly picked up the buoys marking Margaretta Shoal, past Mutton Island, and tied up outside Galway docks at about 1:30 for the tide. At that time, the locks into Galway docks only opened at about 2 hours before high water. And in the afternoon, Colin Bailey, myself and Ray rowed her into the new docks where we tied up. And there she is. You could see the hold there and the general layout. Here she remained for 2 months, much to my frustration, while the spars and other necessary items were acquired. The spars were cut at Roscahill sawmills near Loch Corrib, and the fitting of them carried out by a local shipwright, Pat O'Sullivan. There's another view, and it's interesting because it shows a little doorway into the cuddy up forward, where we slept, and shows the open hole. You can see this, the boom and gaff have been removed. The spars were cut at Roscahill sawmills near Loch Corrib, and the fitting out of them carried out by the local shipwright, Pat O'Sullivan. In Galway, I received considerable help and advice from a number of people, but particularly Mike Casey, whose beautifully restored puckawn was moored in the docks. And this is a shot from the bows of the Star, and you can see the puckawn astern, actually. That's Mike Casey's puckawn. Mike presented us with metal jaws for the gaff. Many locals were astonished to see the Morningstar, which they assumed would never sail again. As the summer was fast disappearing, I realized there was no way I was going to sail her to Dun Laoghaire, but at least I hoped to get her as far as Limerick for the winter. The long delays in getting the boom and gaff replaced and other fittings delayed our departure from Galway till Saturday, 24th September. My crew for the voyage was my long-standing sailing friend and owner of the Gloatiog mentioned earlier, Jim Halpenny, and Jack O'Sullivan, who's pictured there, who had done a considerable amount of rough open-air cruising in small boats. He was also a good navigator, we discovered later. Jim and I arrived down in Galway the afternoon before. There's me on the foredeck, haven't changed much. With the help of Mike Casey, we just had to maneuver the Morningstar out of the dock before the lock gates closed for the next 8 hours and brought her round to the fishery side of the jetty, ready to depart at dawn the next morning. Mike then took us out for a sail in his puckon and showed us the rocks and sandbanks to be avoided when leaving Galway. Mike's experience and attention to detail must have saved us many misfortunes later. He stitched up the luff of the mainsail, which was showing signs of coming adrift from the luff rope. We also discovered that the chocks on the boom to take the main sheet strops were in fact on the wrong side of the spar. We were still attending to these matters in the dark when Jack O'Sullivan arrived from Dublin. That night, Jack and I slept in the little forecastle cuddy, but Jim preferred to sleep out on the open poop deck under a tarpaulin. The breeze next morning was light east-northeast with poor visibility. Under main and flying jib, we cleared the narrows at the entrance to Galway harbour on one tack, and we were again impressed by how close to the wind the star pointed, which we weren't expecting. We rounded Mutton Island in the mist, set the staysail, rounded the buoys marking Margaretta Shoal, and set course to pass about 2 miles off Black Head, the southern tip of Galway Bay, which was invisible in the mist. This meant we were on a dead run. On one occasion, a momentary lapse of concentration caused a standing jibe, and the great boom came over with remarkable violence, even in that gentle breeze, because the mainsail is a very powerful sail. And Paul Keogh and the Nave Cronin crew will know all about this. It's something to be avoided. This was a good lesson and taught us what to avoid in the future. The wind gradually freshened, and we were able to bring the star onto a broad reach, and she really surged along at a good 7 knots. The Galway motor ferry Nearvena appeared out of the mist on her way to Arran, and those on board reported our position to Mike Casey back in Galway. And I think the Nearvena is actually preserved in Galway now. The breeze was, however, short-lived. As we came through the South Sound between Inisheer and Black Head, it gradually died. We also began to feel the pull of the north-going tide against us. Progress became abominably slow as we cleared the Sound at about 1400. As the wind fell away, we realized there was no way we were going to get down the coast and round Loop Head into the Shannon by nightfall. The anchorage along the west coast are not good, particularly in a boat without an engine. We were also aware that in a flat calm in the night, the swell could carry us under the 600-foot cliffs of Moher, which were in the mist only a few miles away to port. At about 1600, we made the agonizing decision to turn back to Kilronan on Inishmore, as the breeze had dropped to force 1 at best. We were aware that at that stage we were about 3 miles from the Aran Islands and had no alternative but to swing out the ancient and warped sweeps and row. The rowing position was on the poop deck, and the rowers stood one behind the other with one oar each. The forward oarsman had to keep strict time with the man in front in order not to clout him in the small of the back. It took about 10 strokes before the 12 tons of hooker began to move forward, but once moving, the momentum could be kept up. As the sun came out and it began to get hot, we began to realize what it was like to be a galley slave in days of old. We made for Foul Sound between Inishmaan and Inisheer. A fitful little easterly breeze came up and ruffled the flat calm, but it still took us 2 hours to get to the Sound, and the flood tide behind us was easing off, so we continued to assist our progress by rowing. As we glided silently round Inishmaan, a motorized curragh came at great speed across from Inishmore and offered us fish, which we gratefully accepted, and the kind man refused to accept any payment. We came across all these wonderful acts of kindness all over the place. We cooked the fish right away and had dinner. And as we crept past Straw Island in the gathering darkness with its lighthouse winking to port and approached Kilronan Harbour on Inishmore, on entering, we rounded into the breeze and dropped anchor. The pier was crowded with fishing boats, some moored 5 abreast. We raised anchor and rowed up the pier. To our great surprise, we came alongside another hooker, the Tony, none other than Morningstar's sister ship, which is still, of course, also sailing today, also built by Brownlee, owned by Mike O'Brien. She had also been restored the previous winter and had just delivered a cargo of turf, which was piled on the quay. Mike was astonished and delighted to see us. In the forward cuddy, they had an open turf fire burning in a grate, emitting wreaths of smoke which issued forth out of a chimney in the foredeck. On Sunday, 25th September, we rose at 7 a.m. to find that Mike O'Brien had taken Tony back to Carraroe in the early hours. We obtained water from the quay, then warped and poled the Star out to the pierhead and anchored off to set sail. The wind was east-southeast, moderate, and the tide was ebbing fast through Gregory's Sound, which separates Inishmore from Inisheer. And with the tide behind us and a good breeze, we made good progress. Visibility was quite poor, and at 1300 lost sight of Inishmore and the Clare coast to port. Aware that we could be set in by the swell, we cautiously set course to pass within 5 miles of Loop Head. However, after sailing on this course for a few hours, we decided, as the wind was offshore, to harden in to close the coast on a beat. That's Jim Halpenny on the helm. At 1550, we finally sighted, just 2 to 3 miles away to port, massive 300-foot high cliffs rising sheer out of the sea, punctuated by great black caves with their feet washed by the roaring surf, later identified as Kilkee Point. And there's Jack O'Sullivan on the helm. The cliffs back the wind to the east-northeast, putting us on a glorious broad reach, and the Star foamed along at a good 8 knots, and we came abreast of Loop Head at 1900. And that is the Clare coast. This mile upon mile of 300-foot high cliffs, a very formidable and coast that has to be treated with respect. The lighthouse at Loop Head is set high up on the cliffs You can actually just see it there over the top. And a few people could be seen as tiny dots watching us from the top. Immediately on rounding Loop Head into the Shannon estuary, the wind reverted to its original position, east-southeast, dead ahead for our course up the Shannon. And the ebb tide was also against us. The sun set as we started beating against a freshening wind and tide. We made short tacks up the North Shore, but had to take care as we couldn't see it in the gathering darkness. Until the tide changed at 2300, progress was zero. You'd make progress on one tack, and then you'd lose it on the other tack. And it began to get cold. And when it did turn, the wind was against tide, kicking up a short, steep sea. There was no question of running into any anchorages on the North Shore, as they were all exposed to the southeast wind. So we bashed on past Dunmore and Kilclutha Heads. Tacking out of Kilbaha Bay in the strong wind after midnight, the jib began to come apart. Jim Halpenny and I had a right struggle, getting it in on the heaving foredeck with lifelines attached in case we were thrown overboard. And by the time it was in, the sail was in shreds. Of course, the boat was totally unbalanced under staysail and main. We all reefed the main in the moonlight, and thank God for that moon. Otherwise, we were in total darkness. No fancy deck lights on this ship. Even with the reef, tacking was slow and often required the staysail to be back to get her round. The wind increased to force 6, and we were glad of the reef in the main. We were pleased, however, that the Star didn't take in any water, and there were no more serious breakages, and so we continued all night. When Jack O'Sullivan took over the helm in the early hours, his navigational skills in the dark really proved themselves, and we successfully avoided all hazards. The wind eventually fell light, and at dawn found us off Carrigaholt Bay. At 6:30, the tide turned against us, so we ran into Carrigaholt and rounded off the pier beneath the ruined castle and dropped anchor. Hooker men of Connemara would, I've no doubt, have run us straight into the little quay, but I simply didn't have the confidence to achieve this with a following wind, and there was nobody on the pier to take a line. So we adopted the somewhat unorthodox method of reversing round the pier head, paying out our anchor rope as we did so, controlling her with the oars till her stern came to the quay, and 3 exhausted crew scrambled ashore. And that is Carrigaholt Quay. The Star is almost invisible there. This photo. When we were then greeted by Mr. Keating, the local taxi owner, who had driven down to the quay, and he gave us a lift up to the village to make reports and send telegrams. Remember, we're in a different era. After a meal and brief rest at 1400, we hauled away from the quay, hauled in the anchor, and ran before the fresh southeasterly under bare pole up to the old pier at the village, steadying her with the oars as she went, with the anchor ready in the stern in case of trouble. John Keane, the owner of the shop and pub nearest the quay, directed us to the deep water berth. From the Aran Islands to the Shannon at Carrigaholt, we hadn't seen one boat or ship. The Atlantic and the Shannon estuary appeared to be completely deserted. Total distance from Galway was 110 miles. Weather deteriorated considerably from here on, and our free time was very limited. So the Morningstar remained at Carrigaholt through to November. I drove down the 200 miles from Connolly every weekend to pump out the rainwater, and John Keane kept an eye on her in the meantime. The kindness and help we received from him was typical of our experiences in the West. Our next plan was to bring the Star up to Foynes, 25 miles away upriver, and from there up to Limerick. Our free time was limited to weekends, so as winter was closing in fast, we decided to bring her up the Shannon and from there across to Dublin on the Grand Canal. My attempts to get a crew of 3 for this leg failed. So Jim Halpenny and I decided we could do it ourselves. Handling a 12-ton open boat with no engine or mechanical aids, we found hard work, but okay in quiet waters. But we doubted she would be manageable with less than 3 in heavy weather at sea. However, a crew of 2 was very much the normal crew for a boardmoor in the West. On Saturday, 13th of November, Jim and I drove down to Carrigaholt with all our gear, including a borrowed jib from the Hooker Connacht, recently restored by Con McCann, to replace that which had been torn apart coming up the estuary. The Connacht, I think, was the oldest hooker afloat at that stage. Our plan was to get up at 5 a.m. on Sunday morning to move the Star out to anchor in the bay while there was still water under her. Anchor, and then weigh anchor again at about 10:30 a.m. to catch the first of the flood up to Foynes. The strong spring ebb tide running out of Carrigaholt was a great asset. It was our engine in the absence of the mechanical version. And we prepared the anchor for lowering with oars and boat hook ready for use and released the last remaining mooring line. We put no sails up, but moved with the tide under bare poles slowly down the pier, fending off and guiding the boat when necessary. Jim gave a last heave on one oar to get us round the end of the pier, and they all snapped in half, but we were clear. The oars were in a very ancient condition. We did expect them to last a bit long. And subsequently, I replaced them. They were available, believe it or not, in Perry's in Dunleary, who were the yacht chandlers there in those days, long gone, sadly. And they had these magnificent 17-foot sweeps, beautifully made and balanced, but pretty heavy and huge. And I asked them, why do you have these in stock? Who buys these? Oh, well, they said, this is for the mail boat. I said, what? For the mail boat? Oh, they said, it's for the lifeboats. I said, are they expecting the passengers to swing these things while their ship goes down? But apparently, it was so. Obviously, Dunleary hadn't advanced much since the Titanic. Interesting. Drifting well out into the bay, we dropped anchor in 3 fathoms. At 10:30, we heaved up the anchor and bore away under mainsail and flying jib. The borrowed jib was not a good shape, but it was strong and served its purpose. The forecast was for strong westerly winds veering northwest, force 6. I contemplated reefing, but Jim persuaded me not to do this, and running downwind towards Scattery, we hoisted the staysail as well and forged along at about 6 knots. It was a grim day with hurrying grey clouds and occasional drizzle, but we revelled in the glorious sail downwind, and we passed Scattery Island at about 12 noon. A friend, Dan Ryan, resident at Kappa near Kilrush, had made arrangements with Mike O'Brien, the owner of a motor launch at Foynes, to pull us in when we arrived off the town. Looking through his binoculars above his house, he reckoned we wouldn't arrive till at least 4 p.m. There were times when the bends in the estuary put us on a dead run, and care had to be taken to avoid a standing jibe, which would actually have been catastrophic in that wind. And there were times also when we were on a broad reach and the Star really surged along at 8 knots. Consequently, when we came abreast of Mount Trenchard, about half a mile from Foynes, where the launch was supposed to meet us, we were about 3 hours ahead of schedule. As no launch was in sight, Jim and I started making preparations for our own landfall. The tide was half up and fairly ripping through the narrows between Foynes Island and the mainland as we came abreast of the harbour. As we prepared to drop anchor just upstream of the piers, suddenly we could see absolute panic among a crowd ashore, and the launch came out to meet us, taking our lines and bringing us in. Mike moored us alongside an ancient little wooden coaster, the Sensennan, on the east side of the harbour, where we could take the ground at low tide in a soft, oily featherbed of mud. Of course, Foynes has been hugely developed since that time. Dick Scott, the owner of a beautifully restored and converted Glotjog Orla, moored at Foynes, was amongst the numerous people in the reception committee. And there she is again alongside the Sensennan in the mud. The interest taken by people at Foynes was considerable and the hospitality overwhelming. A very serious and officious customs officer came down to take our details, and I don't think he was treated with the respect that was his due. Our next weekend hop was from Foynes to Limerick docks, and again Jim Halpenny was my sole crew. We arrived down at Foynes on Friday night, 16th of December at 23:15 in the dark. It was a beautiful night with a light southwesterly breeze, and although the tide had been ebbing for an hour, there was still plenty of water under her. So after we had loaded in our gear, we warped her out to a small floating pontoon, which had water at all stages of the tide. And all this took us till 1:30 a.m. The following morning, there were warnings of severe gales in the Shannon. And by mid-morning, the gale duly arrived with heavy rain till noon. So we stayed put. The following night, the gale increased still further and screamed in the rigging, and the Star jumped about so much against the little pontoon, we had a far from restful night. Sunday morning, the gale had moderated to a fresh southwest breeze, and we set sail at 8 a.m. with mainsail and flying jib. By 1100, we passed Shannon Airport and were able to carry full sail, and the sun came out and we passed Bunratty Castle, a majestic sight from the river. The Star was now doing 7 knots through the water, and when the tide turned, we were able to stem the fast-flowing ebb with no problem. Most exhilarating December sailing. During most of the time, the wind was dead aft, and we did have to jibe twice to keep to the twisting channel. We navigated successfully past all the marked rocks and islands leading up the channel until we passed Spilling Rock. And here, the river appeared to open out into a wide expanse of water, but we were deceived by this and failed to recognize a small port-hand buoy, almost invisible, marking the channel close along the south bank. We were well north of this and ran hard aground in deep mud on a falling tide about 2 hours after high water. The tide ebbed fast and the water around us quickly disappeared, leaving Morningstar high and dry. We were bitterly disappointed, as we had hoped to be up in Limerick in daylight. The mud under us was very soft, but fortunately, in a way, might have been rock. But Jim Halpenny was undaunted and carried our anchor about 50 yards towards the main channel and dropped it, so we could haul off at the first opportunity when the tide rose. His booted feet sunk deep at every step, and I was afraid he'd get stuck altogether, but he succeeded. You can actually see in this picture the anchor rope laid out in the mud and Jim's footsteps. Dreadful navigation on my part. And here we were to wait for 9 hours. We had a good meal at an angle of 45 degrees, and the sun went down on a glorious evening, followed by a calm, moonlit night with the birds crying across the mudflats. At 2100, we had enough water under us and hauled out to the anchor, which we heaved out of the mud with some difficulty. There was very little wind, and what little there was dead ahead, necessitating us to tack up the narrow channel in the dark. However, the red and white leading lights marking the channel up to Limerick were an excellent guide, and we safely passed all the rocks in the channel as we glided silently along in the blackness. At about 1 a.m., the breeze died away completely, and we began to go backwards. We dropped anchor again on Muckinish Mud, just outside the channel, about 2 miles from Limerick, and in sight of the lights of the town. We certainly weren't going to row her against the tide. During the night, a near gale sprang up from the southwest, and a grey morning found us wildly swinging to our anchor just inside the main channel. Here the channel turned southward for about half a mile, necessitating tacking. But initially, we were afraid to hoist the main in a near gale, so we attempted to beat with the staysail only. And as Paul Keogh will testify, it's virtually impossible in a hooker. This was a dismal failure, and we were compelled to drop anchor again on a lee shore, about 5 yards from the bulrushes on the port side of the channel. There was nothing for it but to hoist the main treble reefed and jib and attempt to claw off the bank into the near gale for a standing start. To our amazement, the Star achieved this with the minimum of leeward drift, which confirmed to us how handy this boat is. An immediate tack was required to get away from the bank, which was only achieved at the second attempt, and with the bank only 3 yards from our stern. In the last mile before Limerick, the channel turns east again, and we were now running dead before a full gale. So we were able to lower all sail and run under bare pole at about 2 knots. As a precaution, we had the anchor set up in the stern in case of emergencies. In those days, Limerick docks leaked, so to conserve water, they closed the gates at dead high tide, which was actually 12 noon, which was exactly the time we rounded the last bend. To our horror, we saw the gates closing ahead of us, so threw out the anchor out of the stern and came to a shuddering halt. The gatemen must have seen us, so to our relief, the kind souls took pity on us and opened the gates again. We hauled in the anchor, which was quite an effort in that wind, and off we went again as fast as before, with nothing up. She actually steered very well running under bare poles. And as we shot through the gates, Jim shouted up to the dockers, "We have no engine," and threw up our line. And one man with great presence of mind checked it round a bollard, and we were safely in. It was just as well, because later the wind increased to storm force. We received nothing but kindness from everyone in Limerick docks, from the young harbour master downwards. They had to shift her around a bit in the docks over the next few weeks to make way for big shipping. Jimmy Jones, the crane driver, drew out the mast with a 20-ton crane with great skill and no fuss. Over the rest of the winter, by weekends, we brought the Morningstar up the Shannon and across on the Grand Canal to the Liffey and over to Dunleary. Here, I was in the strange position of being a cadet member of the Royal Irish Yacht Club, paying £3 a year, with a 12-ton Galway Hooker with no engine on a club mooring, which was as far away as possible from the club where I could do the least damage. But that is another story.
Dennis, that was so evocative. It really was. I loved every minute of it.
Well, I'm delighted.
Yep, it was really great, Dennis. Fantastic.
Well, I'm delighted.
How many years did you have the Morningstar for, Dennis?
I had her for another 5, over 5 actually, 6 years. And then I sold her to a syndicate who did nothing with her at all and left her exposed to the open for years in Cole Harbour, slowly deteriorating again, and I saw all my work of restoration disappearing. And then along came John Helion, who started all over again and not only rebuilt her, but extended her and deepened her and changed her quite a bit. And she is still afloat, racing in Great Man's Bay. And she's owned by Tommy Kelly of the Mormeen Quay. She's nearly in the same place where I found her, within half a mile of Tierney Quay.
Like for a boat that's what, maybe 140 years old, she's only had you the second owner, third, fourth. Tommy Kelly is the 5th owner.
Yes, the Connolly's me, the syndicate, and then John Helion and me. Yes, there were only 5. Only 5 owners. Yeah.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah.
I think the Connolly's may have had her built, but this would have been Joe's father or grandfather, perhaps. Joe Connolly has died now, which is sad. But I'm still in touch with all the family, and we have great memories.
And Dennis, what sailing experience did you have before you took on this project?
Well, my mother taught me to sail in a Dublin Bay Mermaid, and I raced with her at the age of 10. And then I was in London for about 2.5 years, and you can't be in London without getting a boat. So I got a Lymington scow and sailed down the Thames. I learned all about tides there, which race through the bridges at 5 knots. London, of course, was a very different place from what it is now. Huge flat iron colliers would come up the river, going under the bridges, dropping their funnels as they went under the bridge, and to service Battersea Power Station and other power stations. So there was quite big traffic, commercial traffic on the Thames in those days. But nowadays, I think it's all pleasure craft.
Dennis, well done. That was a fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it. Must say I really enjoyed the pictures. It's fantastic to see the old pictures, to actually see the shape of the boat. You could really see Brownlee's footprint there. Really fantastic. The locals used to call the boat Bod Fada. They used to call it.
Well, now, Fada was Joe's brother.
Yes.
So he must have been the owner, in fact.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it was a family boat, as far as I know, but it was some of the older people in the island still call it Bod Fada to this day.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
That's fantastic. Right. What's so great about them is they're so steady, and you can do things with them you can't do with a modern yacht. There was one occasion I lashed the helm off the Bailey Light, and I did not touch that helm right across Dublin Bay, right through the harbour mouth and right up to the mooring without touching. The boat sailed herself the whole way. All I had to do was release the helm and round up to the mooring buoy. And also, although the response is slow, it's very steady and very predictable. My first sail across Great Man's Bay, I was very impressed with the way they handled all that. And I could certainly sympathize with Paul and the Nave Cronin crew about jibing, because the mainsail is a very, very powerful sail, and for jibing has to be treated with great respect, I say.
Yeah, but if you look at the whole design, actually under the water, they're quite a yacht-like.
Yes, and very fast off the wind.
Yeah.
Dennis, I can attest to the jibing, because Jerry Murta and I acquired Tuna, and we also discovered OGA, DBOGA, and I think on that first weekend regatta there was a race or a talk of a race, and the Morningstar was there with Johnny Helium.
All right.
Sounds right. And out we went to join in the fun, and ahead of us down the bay, the Morningstar jibed.
Right.
And there was great confusion and everything, and she retired.
Oh, right.
We were surprised to see it, but some damage must have been done, maybe.
Right.
Maybe the main sheet, but that was the first time we ever saw that jibe, and it is a monstrous sail. You know, we could.
Yeah. I had great fun on one occasion in Dublin Bay. I had 13 young people on board, and they were all full of enthusiasm, and we had to jibe, and I started hauling in and making fast, hauling in the main sheet and making it fast and getting ready, and they said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll hold on to it." And it was a gentle, I said, okay. And it was a very gentle breeze. And they hung onto the main sheet. And when the boom came across, it swept all 13 of them right off the deck into the hold, and spectacles flew and everything. Of course, it was no damage because it was a very gentle day. But the power of it was impressed on these people, that you didn't take chances with it.
How big was the main over your transom when you were sailing there, Dennis?
It was the boom was a good foot over the transom. Yeah.
Fortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the
At least.
star, I don't know about now, but when Johnny had a star, I'd say it was about 7 foot. Yeah.
Wow.
And when we launched the Crown on first, she was a model of her, and it was, we took 3 feet off it. And then about 2003, we took another, 2003, 2004, we took another 3 feet off it. It was just, it wasn't a pleasure to sail. You know, it wasn't a pleasure to sail.
Yes, the weather helm, they love the weather helm in the West, but it was actually excessive. And, you know, they reckoned that if anything happened, the boat would run up to the wind, and safety factor.
Dennis, if I could just change the line of questioning for a moment. First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, because I've done a lot of that trip, but in the opposite direction with David Beattie in his sailing barge Scolavar. But we had a thumping great big engine. So you somewhat glossed over the fact was, well, we went from Limerick up the Shannon, up the canal, and arrived to Dublin. Is there going to be another presentation about that trip, or can you, you tell me how on earth you did that without an engine?
You won't believe this, but there was actually, by the time we got to Limerick, we had fitted to the transom a monstrous framework. and on it we put a Century Plus outboard motor, which pushed at about 2 knots the Morningstar up the Shannon, occasionally going backwards, I may say. I mean, there were a few occasions, and the Shannon was in flood, and there were a few occasions when we looked down and could see fencing posts under the keel. We realized that we'd strayed. We were going over farmland.
So that was through the winter then?
Through the winter, yeah. And some of the weather was atrocious. There was one from Robertstown on, we had snow driving horizontally. And needless to say, the Star went aground. The Grand Canal was not well maintained in those days.
Of course.
Lock gates were not very well maintained either. And we went aground on many occasions, particularly after Tullamore. The closer we got to Dublin, the more we went aground. And we had to shift all the ballast out of the hold. She was drew 4'6" in those days. Now I think she draws at least 5.
6.
So 6. So we couldn't do it now. But she was a fairly light hooker. And when I had her, she was very good in light winds. She would trickle along on very little.
Well, you've answered my question. You fitted an engine.
We fitted an engine, yeah.
Thanks.
We did say that. We put up a jury rig going through Loch Derg, and that helped us along. But otherwise, it was outboard motor, and it was a very tedious. But the only advantage. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there were times when we were actually glad it was an outboard because we had to lift it to get the weed off. If it had been an inboard engine, we could have got an awful lot of stuff around the propeller. So it probably was just as well. It was an outboard.
Dennis,
from experience, I can concur with that.
Right.
Dennis, I can concur.
Thanks,
I can concur with you. I can concur with you about this. The Century. I have a Silver Century Plus long shaft with 5 blades.
Oh, 5 blades.
It would push a barge. It's an incredible machine. But I am absolutely astonished at your modest description of all you achieved with the Morningstar back then. I think it was a fantastic voyage, extremely modestly described, and I think there's great credit due to you. And I love the talk.
Thank you very much, but it was madness. I mean, really, when I look back on it, and we didn't have any radio, transmitting radio. We had no lights. Well, we did have an oil lamp, but as we never saw another craft for all that time from Galway, apart from the Nervena and the little currach that came out to sell us fish, we didn't see another craft at sea from Galway all the way to Carrigaholt.
That time of year, they were all ashore.
All ashore. And the Tony, I'm delighted to hear that the Tony, which is the sister ship we met in Kilronan, is still sailing, which is great news. She was delivering turf. She was still trading, and she'd unloaded turf on the quay when we arrived at Kilronan. So then I suppose Mike O'Brien has also departed this life. So many that I knew then, and Pat Jennings, I think, long gone now.
Any idea, Dennis, what was your total cost of your restoration?
The total cost, I reckon, was, when it was all added up, about 1,400, 1,200. But it was spread out, you see, over, well, 18 months, really, or over a year. And it was rather like, hire purchase. I paid the builder by the week. And of course, as we know, I mean, there were times I'd go down and nothing appeared to have been done, but I knew very well that this is the way it goes when you're restoring a boat. You think you're getting absolutely nowhere, and then suddenly you're flying, you know. So I had to bite my tongue if I went down and saw virtually nothing done. But they were scrupulously honest, and Michael Flaherty did a fantastic job, no question about it. With hand tools, lying in the shingle, unbelievable.
Yeah, fantastic.
Dennis, may I ask you? You had her painted with pitch, and
yes,
yes. Did you continue? Did you continue with that?
I did. Yes,
in your ownership. Yeah.
I did actually, and the club boatmen in Dunleary weren't too pleased bringing a launch alongside because it was a bit inclined to come off.
Especially on a summer's day.
Yes, on a summer's day in the heat. Yeah.
Pitch for pitch.
And that picture of her in Dunleary, the two people on board there are Jim Halpenny and Anne Wolfe Flanagan, who I'm looking at the moment.
Hi.
So she came out in this craft on a few occasions and enjoyed it.
You never
Absolutely, it's great trips.
You never filled an inboard diesel, Dennis, did you?
We never put an engine in it, no.
Right.
We got, progressively we got more and more skilled, but I mean, I'm still not up to the legendary skills of the hooker men in the West. I mean, they bring these boats in through rocks and up to the quay under sail in all weathers, in all conditions, and they might as well be parking a car. So I never got to that skill. I brought her into Cole Harbour under sail, and after a race, and when we left under sail, the whole club came out on the balcony to see us break the place up. But we got out all right under sail, because she's very predictable. You could look ahead and plan what you were going to do. Very steady, and
I've seen lots of them coming in and out of Kinvara, which is a very sharp turn into the harbour, and they could use eggs as fenders and wouldn't break them. Some of them are just impassable.
I'm absolutely amazed. And some of the helmsmen in the West, when they get onto the land, they fall down. But when they when they're in their boats, they are like quicksilver. And I could never. I raced against Pat Jennings and many others in the Kinvara Festival with a glow tug, which I had later, and I never could beat Pat Jennings. He was a brilliant helmsman, total concentration, and when he went about, he never bore away too much or pinched or any of that stuff. He was, and the best I could do was come second. When Pat was there, I could never win the race.
And what boat was he racing in? The Hunter?
He was in a big glow tug, a half boat, they called it. And it had absolutely no modern gear whatsoever. Had the calico sails, no modern gear at all, and everything was perfection. And he and another man tacked up ahead of me up the Kinvara River, and we'd overtaken all the others, but I could never catch him. And every time he tacked, he was another couple of feet ahead.
Dennis, what sort of use did you subsequently get out of the Morningstar during the 5 or 6 years that you had her?
Well, it was just local sailing, really. Mm-hmm. We didn't take her on any major cruises, actually. But it was a great experience, and it taught me a lot about how to handle boats in strange conditions. running under bare poles was a favorite occupation, because she actually steered remarkably well, even, you know, with the wind on the quarter, with no sails up at all in a full gale. And that was a great asset, actually. Of course, the mast was the thickness of a telegraph pole. The rigging was incredibly simple. The only rigging that was wire was the mainstay, which was linked to the stem head by deadeye and lanyard through holes in the stem head. The shrouds were manila rope, again attached with lanyard. So the mast was really stood on its own, and there were no bobstay. The jib was hauled out by a traveller, which was dropped under a cleat just above the water line, which made a bobstay out of the lanyard, out of the halyard, out of the, this picture now, behind Jim Halpenny's head, you can see the mainstay coming down and the deadeye and lanyard coming down and joining it to the stem head. The rigging was incredibly simple. No whiskers on the...
No whiskers at all, no.
No whiskers either. And of course, in the heavy weather, that spar bent.
That was
particularly tacking up the Shannon in that near gale. It certainly whipped. I was a bit anxious.
But that was a safety thing. That was a safety thing, Dennis. They used to do that when the mast bent. It actually distorted the sail, and it emptied some of the sail. So if you were under pressure, so there was a certain logic behind that.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Right. She spilled away. Yes, yeah.
Good design.
Yes, yeah.
Native design, I suppose you'd call it.
Yes.
It's been developed for centuries, really.
Well, the most thing I noticed there was actually on the rig, how small the rig is compared in the pictures was compared to today's rigs.
Yes. Well, of course, the mast was a bit too small, in a way. And Joe told me that. He said it should be a bigger mast. And the mainsail probably should have been bigger as well. But it did its work, and amazing wartime material. And really, khaki, you can actually just see the color of it when the picture of her.
Yes.
And we replaced the jib and the staysail.
Tell us the story of that jib being made, will you? It's a
Yes,
great story.
it was remarkable because both the headsails I took back to Josie Hines Bartley, who was the sailmaker for many of the hookers on Lettermullen. And I brought the staysail down to him after the jib, actually, and he just laid it on the grass outside his cottage. He stretched twine between the three corners, and then he got his spade and cut the roach, the curve at the bottom of the staysail. And then he said, you can take the sail away now, and I'll have it done in about 2 or 3 weeks. And when I came back, bringing the old sail with me, it was totally different. It was much bigger. And I said, this can't be right. And he said, oh, well, your old sail didn't come down to the deck. It was pretty short. This one will come down to the heel of the bowsprit. And that man had not made a sail for that boat probably since the war or before. you know, it was probably 20 years, and he had obviously the shape of the sails in his head. Unbelievable. And the calico I got at Croxon and Dobbs in on the quays in Dublin, they still had calico for sales, believe it or not, in the 60s. And the bark was put on by Josie Hines Bartley. He put the bark on. A charming man, and he's gone to his reward as well. He and his charming wife. He had a wonderful set of working models of hookers in his house, which they used to race against, apparently. And you can see in that picture the oars I got in Perry's and Dunleary. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the passengers on the mail boat swinging those in the lifeboats as the ship went down? I was just amazed, but there they are on the side, slung outboard.
Oh. Wow.
Guys, if I could ask a small question. I'm very interested. Sorry, it's Richard here. I had the camera off for several reasons. And I was just reminded by Philip McMahon, if anybody remembers back in the 90s, Dick Warner taking, I think it was Waterways to Series 2. He took Scullivar up, I think it was down the Royal Canal, I think, because he took the 45M down the Shannon for the first series. But what interests me is the origins of the Galway Hooker. And a lot of English gaffers, or Thames Spritzel barges and West Coast cutters and pilot cutters, have a very similar look. They'd look very like Sean's Tiernan Og or our own Crabber 22. But there's a very definite Dutchness about the Galway Hooker. And maybe Donal, who's a shipwright by trade,
and the name, of course,
to shed some light on hooker or hooker or however it's pronounced, and the origins thereof. Because we're talking 1890, so it's mid-19th century design. Does anybody have any light on that? I know that's getting dim out, but if there's any light,
they're much older than 1890. If you looked at something like the pictures of the Connacht, you see that the hull is much rounder. By the time of Brownlee's construction, they were becoming more V-shaped. Now, Brownlee's boats didn't have a great draft. Like the Tony doesn't have a great draft, but they were very wide. What we say is that the foothook is flat. So now this was obviously for carrying in shallow waters. But I'm skeptical about the whole Dutch thing. I really am. I don't see the connection. I think more of this has come from English, because even, for example, the words, the names of parts of the boats, while most of them are in Irish, some of them are in English, and there are words that have come down through the ages in English, and you'd be kind of wondering, on that alone. But I think I've seen Edgar Marshall's book. I've seen some pictures of hookers from England, and they're not that dissimilar. So now maybe like we in the West, people usually really call it a hooker or a hooker. They usually call them a Bodmore, and that was it. Now I'm a bit skeptical about the whole Dutch thing. I think in my opinion, it's more likely from an English design. Pre-1700s, you more than likely had cutters and three-masted boats in the West. There's definitely, back in a place called Mace, which is near Carna, there was a family there called Bellistroms, and they were actually pirates, and they were regularly trading down to Limerick, actually. And this is documented because they actually killed a guy in Limerick, and one of them was actually hung because of it. So this is documented. So they had something similar to a pilot cutter at the time. So I have a suspicion that that the Hooker was probably an evolution of a rowing boat, in my opinion.
Right.
And that just everything was stretched and got bigger, and that it worked and it carried cargo, and they were easy to run. Like 2 men, as you said, there 2 people could actually run them.
Yes.
And I think it was a design that became successful, and it just that was it. And I think the reason it was there was no outside influence. I think definitely that's one of the reasons it stayed there was no outside influence.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. It's probably a design that worked, and as the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it worked for the local conditions.
Yeah. Well, this is it. And even there, I was just thinking there, you know, what Dennis has done there, those pictures and things are invaluable, because we don't have a documented history of the hookers. All we have is an oral history of them. We don't really have a documented history. So like pictures like that are invaluable. Like for someone like me, who's looking at the way they're constructed.
Yes.
Invaluable.
Well, the one showing the inside, the frame of the Morningstar, that photo is very evocative. I mean, it's absolutely massive construction. I forget which number that was. Number 7, yes. Absolutely massive. It was an interesting photo. There we are, yeah.
Is there any chance similarity with Breton boats? Some of those seem very similar, and they're operating in very similar conditions, aren't they?
Right. I don't know about that.
There is a very. We were tied up in Brest, not Brest. We were in Camaray, I think, in 2004, alongside some Breton boats, which were very, very similar. Mm. They didn't have the same buff bow, but other than that, they were very similar to the West of Ireland boats, with the thwart open, very, very light. But they didn't have the same buff bow, like.
And did they have the cut-in transom, which is so evocative? You know, it's a
not as sharp as like if the Hooker one says at 45 degrees, it wasn't as sharp as that. Like,
oh, right.
Yeah, does anybody remember that a whole fleet of Breton fishing boats carrying grandfathers, fathers, and sons were overwhelmed by a gale way back when? I can't remember, but it caused consternation. Of course, it wiped out a whole community of 3 generations, and it had something to do with the shape of the stern of the boats. In running for shelter, they were overwhelmed.
Right.
I seem to remember that. I can't quite remember the date now, but it was a total disaster, and it took the community down there years and years and years, like several generations, to recover from it. But the whole fleet, every boat was overwhelmed, and they never got to shore.
The Cleggan.
The whole lot.
The whole lot, yeah.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it certainly is with fishermen. They normally go enough to make for shelter before something happens, but it must have been a sudden storm which caught them unawares, and you know.
Plus, they didn't have the benefit of the wonderful meteorological service that we have now.
Yeah. They wouldn't have had. They wouldn't have had barometers or anything like that either.
No.
I seem to remember, didn't they fit aft decks after that?
Something like that, Peter. You're quite right. Yeah. Do you remember that event? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember it. I remember reading of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the half decks were to protect when the sea came over.
Yeah.
To throw it off. Yeah.
But the hooker, if you look at the hooker stem at the waterline, it has remarkably sweet lines.
Yes.
Really sweet lines.
Yes.
Absolutely brilliant. And she doesn't have a big wake either, you know, so
No.
it's a very clever piece of design.
Yeah. The fact that we were able to row her for 3 miles, 12 tons. Now, we didn't have a cargo, but even so, to be able to do that, you know, it took a bit of doing to get any movement, but once you got the movement going.
Yeah, you describe that well. Once you get that mass going, it's just as hard to stop it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. In inertia, the opposition to rate of change of speed, I think. Yeah.
So we had the anchor in the stern on many occasions in case of emergencies, which we did need coming up to Limerick docks. Yeah.
If I might just mention that there's a variant of the hooker, there was a variant in Kinsale, which had a great many of the features of the Galway hooker, except that the stern was there. It had an overhanging stern with the rudder coming down through the deck along the stern post. But they became defunct a lot earlier than the period we're talking about when the hookers began to be laid up. And the last of them were abandoned on the slob down in a place called Rathcorsey in Cork. A group I was with did an archaeological investigation trying to determine what the lines of them were like. And myself and Michael Tyrrell finally put a set of lines together from what information we gleaned down there. It was only after that we found there was a fine model of one in the National Museum. But very, very similar lines. Well, we determined the history of some of the ones that had been abandoned, and we found out that one of them had actually been built in France sometime around the middle of the 19th century. Where exactly now I can't remember, but it's documented all right.
That's very interesting, Cormac, because there's a song called Untitled Chapter, which is actually about a big Galway hooker, and it's owned by a fellow called Pádraig Joyce. And the song was portraying him as being a great seaman and a great boatman and everything. And it's proclaiming in the song that his boat was able to beat the best of the Kinsale hookers any day of the week. And the song dates back to about at least the turn of the last century, perhaps even earlier. So it would tie in. So obviously they had knowledge of them, you know.
Well, there are a few paintings of them by an artist that I mentioned on our site on WhatsApp by Beachy, sail hookers in the Blasket Sound. Very, very similar looking lines, especially in the forehand, almost identical to the Galway hookers.
Of course, there could be another theory about that. There was sometime in the late 1800s.
It's really interesting talking about you sharing your image.
Again, a place called Mace, Half Mace, where there's actually a weather station at the moment. You'd actually see it on the Mace Head weather station. You see it on the news. There was a few boats lost from that area. They were actually in a storm in winter. One of them was actually brand new, and they went south. They were actually pushed south with a northerly wind and ended up in Kerry, and they never came back. Now, the crew actually came back by train. Ironically enough, it was the local parish priest didn't support them. It was actually the local minister that actually sent them back home, paid their way to Galway, and they came from Galway home by boat. But those boats more than likely remained. Now, some people say they were drowned, but more than likely some of them remained in the south. So who knows? Maybe somebody took lines off it, said, "Hold on, this thing works. This thing looks good." You know, it's an interesting, you know.
The stern is markedly different. It's sort of a round, overhanging stern with the rudder coming down through the deck instead of being hung out of the transom as they are in the Galway hookers. But in every other respect, I found them very similar.
I must say, all this gear and lying around in Connemara in the 60s was actually very sad. I mean, I picked up stuff, you know, for half nothing. And it was good gear, you know. it was really actually very sad. And thank God so many people have come along and restored hookers, and they're still going. But it was a very sad time when I first went out, because to see them all lying around all over the place in dreadful condition, it's sad to see. Yeah.
I think, Dennis, as you say, when you went down there first, the poverty was pretty grim.
Yes.
So if you had a boat that no longer had work or of any use, you couldn't afford to maintain it just for the sake of maintaining it. And I think
no, absolutely.
When you still travel around the country, every second or third farmhouse has 3 or 4 cars up the back that the hens live in.
Well, it was similar. Yeah, similar thing. Yeah.
Dennis, was the Ark in Dunleary when you brought the Morningstar up? She was up in the Ark for many years.
Yes, she was in Dunleary, and Dick Fletcher was sailing her, and he converted her to a ketch from being a cutter. She was, what, 43 feet? She was a lot bigger than the Star.
It's quite big, yeah.
And the mainsail weighed a ton. I mean, hoisting it, Dick Fletcher is the only man who could haul it up single-handed. And he decided to change the rig, and she became a ketch. But I understand that the Ark is no more, and came to grief somewhere.
I think she was subsequently in London, if I recall correctly, in a dock in London. But I remember seeing her up on the Hard back in the early 60s, and there were great big holes in it that you could practically climb up through in the flanking before she was restored.
Right.
I thought she was gone beyond, really, but she was successfully restored after that.
And of course, the Comet, which was the oldest that were afloat at that time, she was lost off the Down coast in a storm. Yeah. Very sad. And
what was the difference between the completion of the restoration of the Connolly and the completion of the restoration of Morningstar?
The McCanns restored her about 2 years before I got involved with the Morningstar. So she was already around sailing by the time I went out and found the Morningstar. Yeah. So there were quite a few people, and there was Dick Scott had this beautiful glow chug, which I bought from him in later years and sailed, and Mike Casey, of course, in Galway, and there were many others. One family whose name I forget came down from Belfast and restored the American Moor.
Hussey, was it? Hussey?
No, he was involved with the Connaught, I think. No, it wasn't Hussey. But there were quite a few people. But an awful lot of boats just disappeared into wreckage. Yeah.
Dennis, there was also a small glow chog in Dunleary called the Pamela.
Yes, Harry Knott.
Being converted, Harry Knott, yeah.
He raced her against modern yachts in Cruises 3 or something like that.
Yeah, lovely little vessel. I believe she's still in existence.
I haven't seen her since.
Been converted back to an open boat. As far as I recall now, I seem to recall getting that information somewhere. But she used to winter in Harry Smith's yard in Ringsend.
Yes.
I really saw her there.
Well, he did that quite a few years. It must have been 1960.
Yeah.
Or even before.
I remember saying from the time I was very young now she was in Dunleary.
Yeah. Yes, he was hugely supportive of me. And when we arrived up the Grand Canal, he came out of his office and greeted us as we came up into Ringsend.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But the kindness and the help from people in the West was just unbelievable. I mean, and people just came out and in the dozens to lift the boat up or get the mast down or do some work like that. There was huge cooperation. And
Dennis, around 1966, the Connaught was in Dunleary on the hard, and I think Joe Murphy was working on it. I think a guy by the name of King owned it. John King, was it?
Yes, and I don't know the crew who were.
It was painted white at that time.
Yes, the crew who were lost when she went down off the down coast.
Yeah,
I don't know who they were.
They were. I think they were a member of the. Members of our club, Johnny. Donald McCann and his partner, wasn't it, that went down with the Connaught?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And nobody ever knew what happened.
No, they never went down to it. I think they decided to leave it as a sea grave, you know.
Yes.
But I remember Joe Murphy working on it in Dunleary. I think it was 66 or 68. Yes. I'm not sure.
I remember that. Yeah. And I used to haul the Star out into Cole Harbour Yard every winter. And
I done what you done. I drove down and around Carrow Row looking for a Galway Hooker, and that's all I could see was ones that were ready for the scrap heap.
Yes.
Anything that was like that, they wanted to sell, but they didn't want to sell the good ones.
No.
I think just going back, guys, when the Connaught went down, it was McCann was on it, and his then girlfriend.
And his girlfriend, yeah.
Colin McCann.
Yeah. And his partner.
Pardon?
It's very much involved with the pool bag at that time. They used to come down.
Yeah, that's right.
Tragedy, great tragedy.
A great mechanic.
Really, yeah.
Dennis, Ger Cadigan here from Kinsale. Could I ask you, from your experience, is there or was there a particular point of a following sea that design just wasn't particularly happy with?
Well, I never actually experienced a really serious following sea in that boat. And I don't know what the experience of a hookerman is in that condition. It'd be interesting to know, because we never actually had a situation. I mean, yes, we ran into Limerick docks in a full gale. There were white horses right up there, but they weren't heavy waves. You know, it was inshore.
Yeah, more a chop.
And there was never an occasion when I was out at sea in the Star in heavy weather with a following sea, with a big following sea.
Does she lift? Does her stern lift to a following sea?
Apparently, I am told that she does. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, they do and they don't.
That's what I was thinking. Is there a point where they're prone to being overwhelmed?
Nowadays, I've seen the volunteer on a few occasions. If you're running downwind, running from a heavy sea, I've seen some water come in over the transom. Now this is due to nowadays to the extremely large long boom that's causing a squatting effect. So it probably wasn't happening as much when the boats were trading, because again they had a shorter boom.
Yes.
It was always said that you'd hear anecdotal evidence by the old people that going downwind, they could, from following sea, they could take a drop of water. And
well, didn't Johnny Helion sail her under?
He did. Yeah. And Paul Keogh was on board, I think, when it happened.
I'm only joking.
Paul has lost a lot of weight since then, hasn't he?
I was lucky to say 5 floats. Yeah, that wasn't a following sea. That was just too much sail in a gale, half a gale. But,
yeah,
an unforgettable experience. It's, never again.
And of course, the locals never wore a life jacket. When we went to the Morningstar, they preferred to, and of course, Patrick Brownlee was drowned, aged about 32, in 1892. He hit a rock coming up, I think it was at Kinvara, actually. And they didn't have life jackets, and he was drowned, age 32. So he built all these boats when he was a young man.
Did he get trapped under the boat, I think? Did he?
Yeah. Apparently the mast fell on him. That was the official.
Oh.
Yeah.
Patrick Bradley.
The mast.
Brownlee, yeah.
Right.
There's some of his descendants still in the Clarenbridge area. There's only about 4 boats in existence that are actually Brownlee boats.
Right.
The Star, the Tony, the Lovely Anne, and there's a small little glow tug back in Cairn owned by Noel Connolly, which is about 19 foot, if that. So apparently to our knowledge, they're the only Brownlee boats in existence.
Right. So all 4, did he only build 4 or all 4?
Apparently he built a good few, Paul, but they just fell by the wayside.
Right.
Yeah.
See, there was an awful lot of fine boats that were lost. Like there was some massive boats there. Like people talk about the Ark being an extremely big boat. Like there was boats like the Mary Ann of Galway, who had apparently had a 13-foot beam. You know, she
was 53 feet or something, I believe. Yeah.
The Erin's Hope, she was a very big boat as well, was she? Erin's Hope, Donald, was she a very big boat? Erin's Hope?
Yes, she was another very big boat. Yeah.
She would be Pat Folan's family, would she?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and again, these were all trading boats. And see, the reason people had such an affinity and such help was given. These boats were a lifeline, and they were often boats that kept people. Like, for example, the St. Patrick. The St. Patrick is revered in the Cairn and Rasmuck area because she was a trading boat, and like they were the lifeline. They were the essential service. At the time, and people had a respect for them.
Until the boat roads were tarmacked west of Galway, they were the fastest means of heavy transport, really.
Oh, yeah.
And they carried cattle.
The St. Patrick has changed hands again, the remains of her, what's left of her. Do you think, will she be rebuilt?
I think she will, because the man who has Patrick Connolly is actually a friend of mine. We actually trained together when we were learning to be shipwrights, and I think he will. I was talking to him last week, and I think he will. Patrick certainly has the skills to do it. He has the will to do it. I think it will happen. Now it'll probably be a long-term project.
Right.
He was some timber. It was promised some timber, but I think because of all the COVID and everything, I think that's put everything on a hold. But he will. I would put money on that Patrick will rebuild it and will keep it in line with what it was. Like he'd be very
go back to the original one,
conserving it. Yeah.
Will he go back to I think Paddy Barry extended the Patrick as well, didn't he?
He did. He did.
Will he go back to the original, or will he?
He'll probably go to the extended version. I think he'll probably go to the extended version. Yeah.
Great to hear the Volunteer is still going. And what about the Hunter? Is she?
Yeah, she's still going. Yeah.
Going. And the Ave Maria.
Yes. Well, she's on dry land. She's owned by a fellow actually called Marcus Mulkerns. He's actually a nephew of Pat Jennings. And,
oh right.
Yeah. He has her in Calafinish. Now his son plans to rebuild her, but as of yet he hasn't done anything. But the hull is still intact and she's in fairly good condition.
And the True Light, she's still around.
She is.
And Waidinwara.
Yes, still still going strong. Yeah.
So this is great. Great news.
Just come in, Dennis. It's a fascinating discussion, and with the assembled wisdom there, particularly Dún Laoghaire-based, I might ask some help. I'm trying to trace the history of an unnamed 24-foot 3 inches flow choke, which spent time in Dún Laoghaire, owned by a professional man and his son. She was sold into Galway, the McDonoughs, for a couple of years and done up, and then sold into Waterford, where she's been the last 40 years, and she's now back up in Howth. But it's reputably built in Claddagh in 1890. Right. So I think the boat is about savable. It's been stripped out now, and you can see from one side of the hull through to the other. There's going to be a lot of work involved to make the hull sound again. But it's that period when she was in Dún Laoghaire, and I'd love to try and find out the name of the owner and try and trace her back from there. So I'll just mention it for if anybody.
Yes, I can't
might have some
recall.
thoughts.
I can't recall that one, I have to say. See, I was very lucky because timber was much more available in the early 60s. Oak was much more available. I mean, I had no problem getting all the oak for the frame of the Star. I was just amazed in the West. Now, I think that is not the case now. I think you'd have...
Well, it's some of the work done on this boat so far, there's about 4 or 5 new frames gone in. One is already cracked because the grain didn't follow the contour. Right. And I've been researching it in the US, where there's a lot of craft, rehoning the craft skills of rebuilding the timber boats there. But for some of the working boats, they're using a technique which is cutting up the sheets of polyethylene into strips and then fitting them to the inside of the hulls of the boat parallel to the existing ribs. And the polyethylene doesn't take a nail very well, but it's brilliant at holding screws. So they drill from the inside of the planking and then fit the polythene stringer in, and then a batten or mock rib, and then screw in from the outside of the planking into the polyethylene. That makes the hull strong. It stops it moving about, but that doesn't necessarily going to make it too rigid, so it would suit the older type boats. Right. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it done here in Ireland, or is it even a profanity to think of that kind of method of refurbishment?
Well, one of the issues is not with the timber itself, especially oak. Oak is of the same quality today as it was 200 years ago.
Fair point.
The big difference is the way it's sawn. Yeah. Nowadays, commercial sawn will saw oak through and through. When boat builders were getting timber cut, they actually had, like the Caseys, for instance, actually had a team of men who actually sawn all their timber for them, and they often cut their logs almost quarter sawn. Yes. So that it stopped a lot of this, and a lot of this knowledge pool is going, and it's very difficult to walk into a sawmill and say to some guy, you know, I want a log cut at a certain angle. There's only a few people that will do it for you, like Mick Dunn in Tullamore actually being one of them. He will do it for you. So that's the reason. So when people say oak splits, like okay, all timbers can split, but that's one of the reasons. And it's just I think it's a lack of knowledge. Now certainly the larch that's available today is vastly inferior to what was available in the 60s. Like, right. Yeah. The oak is the same. I would put money on oak being the same. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was very lucky, really, in many ways. Steeped, in fact. when you look back on it, I was lucky not to get wrecked.
Just about. You're cold up, yeah. Why not?
weekend we did that.
Sorry, I think we have somebody trying to get through there. They might try again if they have a question.
I think that was Negley John. Who
right.
seemed to have joined. Maybe at least when I muted him, that background noise stopped.
Disconnect.
Worried about Tim McGuinness.
You would remember this down in Poolbeg. We had a glow choke, High Brazil.
Oh yes, remember it well, John. Remember it well. That was by
Simon Wafer.
Wafer, yeah.
Tom Whelan owned that boat first. Tom Whelan sold that boat to Simon Weaver.
Simon Weaver.
Yeah, Tom Whelan had her. He sold it to Simon Weaver. I think she's in a museum in Galway now. I read something recently on it. Now, I did make inquiries, didn't get anywhere, but I think she is in a museum in Galway. Donald, agree on you anything on that?
I'm not sure if she is, Paul. I know Pat Folden and Michael built a replica of a glow-choke, and it's in a museum in Galway, down at the Spanish Arch. So that may be the one.
The university, is she not?
Possibly. I don't know. I know Pat Folden and Michael definitely built a.
Well, I remember them building that. When people job, they had her painted, and they had to strip the paint off and put on fireproof paint.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. That was just before they done the refurb on the Cronon.
Okay.
That was around 96, 97. No, sorry, 207, 207. She was beautiful, and then they said with the wrong paint. So,
Paul, Joe, you might remember this. There was a glow jug out in Holt. I think it was Brian McCartney owned it.
Yeah.
McCartney owned it.
That was
McCartney, was it?
Mick McCartney owned it.
There was a lot of them out there. Mick McCartney's, what's she called? The North Star on Rail Tour.
Yeah, he's dead now, but I think he is. I'm not sure. She's
not sailing. She's laid up.
She's out of commission for a long time.
Rail Tour. Mick Benton ended up owning her, and she went down the west, and he never did anything with her, so I don't know where she is now. And then there was Frank Carty actually owned her first. He sold her to Mick McCartney. I think Frank Carty that Johnny had built. She
sank in Holt there, I think, and they got her up.
At a regatta, what's his name? The guy who done the survey on the Cronon for us there. He was on her when she sank. Collie Newport.
Oh yeah.
There was another one there as well. That was about 5 or 6 glow chugs out there at one stage, I think, Jimmy.
Duninver
was the one.
She was out in Holt as well, yeah.
Yeah, Johnny built. No, that was Frank Carty's one, yeah. That was excellent, Dennis.
Very well done, Dennis.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dennis. That was brilliant.
Very good. Can I just say, Dennis, I was exhausted by the time I got the Limerick.
Well, yes, is the answer to that. I was certainly exhausted.
You're a brave man to have taken that on at the age of 22.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks very much, Dennis.
A pleasure and great fun. Great fun.
Thank you, Dennis. Lovely.
Very thoroughly enjoyable, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
Very enjoyable.
Well, I had great fun doing it, I have to say. And many thanks to Mark for his expertise, because he's made it. I have no input into that. It's all his work.
Well, just fair play to your memory.
That boat you were talking about, the one that came out of Dunleary, Carney's boat, was it? That boat was over in Innisturk.
Oh,
is that the one with the owns, is it?
The Duninver, yeah. That's over in Innisturk now. Wait a minute.
Yeah, I think she was called the Duninver. Johnny framed her in Dunboyne, and she was planked in Duninver and Donegal, and that's our Donegal. That's where the name
man,
came from.
Mick Carty, wasn't it? Yeah, our Holt had it.
Yeah.
It's for sale now.
Yeah, well, it's down here anyway. It's out on the island now, and it's sailing. It was sailing last year anyway.
That's very
Anyway,
kind.
just thought I'd let you know about that. And thanks very much, Dennis. A wonderful, wonderful experience to hear about all that.
Well, it was
the adventures of the star.
Well done, Dennis.
many.